It all started with the sound of glass shattering in the early hours of the morning. The night was dark, the kind of darkness that swallowed everything, but it was the loud crash that broke the stillness. Eva Marlowe, a woman in her late 50s, had always lived a quiet life until she married her second husband, Gerald. He was charming, wealthy, and had a background that intrigued her, a former lawyer who had left the profession to start a luxury landscaping business. The couple had decided to enter into an open marriage. They both agreed it was the best solution for their strained relationship. Both had pasts, and Gerald's previous marriage had ended in a bitter divorce. Eva, however, had two children from her first marriage, and she had tried to make things work for them. Yet things never felt right. Gerald's affair with one of his younger colleagues, Naomi, and Eva's own relationship with a man named Adam kept the marriage in a precarious balance. Despite their open agreement, the atmosphere in their home remained tense. Eva often wondered if this arrangement was the right thing, but she told herself that it was for the sake of peace. She never questioned her children's safety or the stability of their home until one night when her life would be forever changed. On that fateful evening, Eva was sitting in the living room when she heard a knock at the door. It was her step-grandson, Caleb. The young man, only 22 years old, was Gerald's son from his first marriage. Caleb had recently moved in with them after his mother's sudden passing. Eva had grown fond of him, though he was distant and somewhat secretive. The relationship between him and his father, Gerald, was strained at best. They never spoke about it, but Eva could sense there was something dark underneath the surface. Caleb had come in looking for his grandfather, who was out of town on business. "I need to talk to you," Caleb said, his voice uneasy. Eva could tell that something was wrong. "Come in," she replied, her curiosity piqued. "What's on your mind?" They talked for a while, about Caleb's troubles, his relationship with Gerald, and his struggles with the open marriage. As they spoke, Eva noticed how Caleb's gaze wandered around the room, his hands twitching nervously. He mentioned feeling alienated in the house, and as Eva listened, she couldn't help but feel there was more to the story than he was letting on. But the conversation turned abruptly when Caleb suddenly raised his voice. "You have no idea how much I hate you," he said, staring directly into her eyes. Eva was taken aback. She had always tried to be kind to him, but this sudden outburst was unexpected. "What's going on, Caleb?" she asked, her tone filled with concern. "Why would you say that?" Before he could respond, the front door swung open and Gerald walked in. He didn't seem to notice the tension in the room. Eva, shaken, didn't know what to make of the interaction. Caleb quickly left, saying he was going to meet some friends, but Eva's mind kept racing. What had just happened? Little did she know, the evening would be marked by much more than words. And as the clock ticked on, the unexpected crash, the moment of violence, would shatter the calm of their lives forever. In the coming days, the truth would slowly unravel, piece by piece, with the help of a seasoned investigator who would uncover hidden secrets and unexpected truths that would make Eva question everything she thought she knew about her family. The morning after Caleb's unsettling visit, Eva awoke to a sense of dread. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As she moved through the house preparing breakfast, she couldn't help but recall Caleb's harsh words from the night before. The more she thought about it, the more she realized she'd never truly understood Caleb's relationship with his father, Gerald. And now, with his sudden outburst, she was beginning to wonder just how much she didn't know. Gerald had left for a business trip early that morning, so it was just Eva and Caleb in the house. Eva tried to put the previous night's conversation behind her, thinking it might have been a temporary lapse in Caleb's demeanor, a result of stress or frustration. She kept herself busy, tidying up, reading the paper, but her mind kept wandering back to Caleb. When she went to check on him later in the afternoon, she was met with an eerie silence. His bedroom door was slightly ajar, and she could see the dim light from his desk lamp flickering. She knocked softly on the door and pushed it open. "Caleb," she called out, but there was no answer. The room was empty, except for a few scattered clothes and books. A strong, uncomfortable sense of unease gripped her as she scanned the room for any sign of where he might have gone. The house felt too quiet, almost as if something was lurking in the air, waiting. Eva decided to search the rest of the house. When she reached the basement door, she hesitated. She had always found the basement a bit unnerving, and Caleb had been known to disappear down there for long stretches of time. He'd never explained what he did down there, and she never thought to ask. But today, the thought of him alone in that dark space felt wrong. Taking a deep breath, Eva descended the narrow staircase. The basement was dimly lit, with shadows cast across the old wooden floor. As her eyes adjusted to the light, she froze in place. There, sprawled across the floor, was a figure she never expected to see. Gerald. But he wasn't just sleeping. He was lifeless. Eva's heart stopped as she rushed toward him, her mind in a fog. She knelt beside him, shaking him, trying desperately to wake him, but it was clear he was gone. His face was pale, his eyes wide open in a silent stare. A single drop of blood had dried near his mouth. It was almost as if he had been caught off guard, a victim of something far more sinister than an accidental fall. Fumbling for her phone, Eva dialed 911, her voice trembling as she reported the scene. "There's been a murder. My husband, he's dead." Within minutes, the police arrived. The scene was quickly cordoned off, and Eva was escorted outside to the front lawn. The officers were polite but distant as they began their investigation. Eva, though still in shock, watched as the investigators began to collect evidence, searching the basement for any clues. One of the officers, Detective Mark Lawson, approached her with a grim expression. "Mrs. Marlowe, I'm going to need you to answer some questions," he said, his voice steady. "I know this is difficult, but we need to get to the bottom of what happened." Eva nodded mutely, her eyes scanning the house as the chaos unfolded. She couldn't understand how Gerald, the man she had married, could be lying lifeless on the floor of their basement. "Did your husband have any enemies?" Detective Lawson asked, leading her toward his car for a quiet conversation. Eva thought about the question. Gerald had many acquaintances, but she couldn't think of anyone who would want to hurt him. However, something about the way Caleb had looked at her the night before began to resurface in her mind. She knew Caleb had his issues with his father, but could it have gone this far? "I don't know," she said, struggling to find the words. "But Caleb, my step-grandson, he and Gerald had their differences." Detective Lawson took note, his pen moving quickly across the pad. "We'll need to speak with Caleb. Where is he now?" Eva glanced back at the house. She had no idea. Caleb hadn't come back yet, and she didn't know where he had gone. "We'll find him," the detective reassured her, though his tone carried a hint of suspicion. "I think we have a lot more to uncover here." As the investigation deepened, the first hints of a much darker story began to emerge. Eva's family, which had once seemed so ordinary, was now entangled in a web of secrets, lies, and hidden resentments. And with Gerald's death, nothing would ever be the same again. Detective Lawson's investigation had just begun, and it would uncover far more than Eva could have ever imagined. As the hours passed, the house was transformed into a chaotic crime scene. Eva was still in shock, sitting on the front porch while the detectives and crime scene investigators worked diligently inside. The weight of her husband's death was starting to settle in, but there was a bigger, more pressing matter on her mind. Caleb. Eva hadn't seen him since the previous evening, and he hadn't returned home yet. A feeling of dread washed over her, and she couldn't ignore the nagging thought that Caleb might know more than he had let on. It was an instinct she couldn't shake. The way he had stormed out the night before, the anger in his voice, it was all too much to dismiss. Detective Lawson, after gathering initial evidence and statements from the neighbors, turned his attention back to Eva. "We need to speak to Caleb. Do you have any idea where he might have gone?" he asked. Eva shook her head. "I honestly don't know. He's been distant lately. He hasn't been his usual self." The detective made a quick note and then looked at her with a penetrating gaze. "Mrs. Marlowe, this may be difficult to hear, but I need to ask you directly. Did you ever feel that there was tension between Caleb and Gerald? Any signs of conflict?" Eva hesitated. Her mind raced back to the moments she had spent with Gerald and Caleb, the occasional arguments, the cold silences. There had always been an air of discomfort between them. Gerald had tried to keep a distance, preferring to focus on his work or his own hobbies, while Caleb seemed withdrawn, brooding, as though a storm was brewing within him. "I'm not sure," she replied cautiously. "They didn't get along very well. Gerald never really understood Caleb, and Caleb was always different. He had a lot of his own struggles, and I think he felt out of place in the house, especially with the open marriage. It wasn't something we ever discussed openly, but there were moments when I could tell he wasn't happy here. Detective Lawson took another note, then looked at her with a firm expression. Mrs. Marlowe, I need you to be completely honest with me. You said Caleb left last night, right? Have you ever noticed anything unusual about his behavior? Eva nodded slowly. Yes, now that I think about it, he's been a bit erratic. A few times he'd come home late, acting strange, sometimes even drunk, but nothing like this. I never thought it would lead to this. The detective paused, considering her words carefully. We'll find Caleb, but right now, I need to ask you about your relationship with your husband. Was everything okay between you and Gerald? No secrets? No hidden issues? Eva's eyes flickered nervously. The open marriage, the arrangements, the affairs. They had all seemed harmless at the time, but in the face of her husband's death, she began to wonder if things had been more complicated than she had ever realized. I I didn't know everything, if that's what you're asking. Gerald and I had our arrangements, but I always thought we were on the same page. There were moments when I questioned the whole idea, but I never suspected anything like this. Detective Lawson nodded. It's important that you understand, Mrs. Marlowe, that everything, every piece of information, matters right now, no matter how small or insignificant it seems. Eva sat silently, her thoughts racing. She had always known that the open marriage was a gamble, but she never imagined it would result in murder. As her mind turned over every conversation, every glance between Caleb and Gerald, she found herself wondering if she had missed something important, something that could have saved Gerald. The detective continued his work, but Eva's mind was already elsewhere. She had to find Caleb. She had to know what had happened, and she feared that if he was involved, there was no turning back for any of them. As the sun began to set, Detective Lawson's team made a breakthrough. They had traced Caleb's phone signal to a park on the outskirts of town. Without wasting time, the detective led a team to the location. They found Caleb sitting on a bench, his face buried in his hands, as if the weight of the world was on his shoulders. He didn't resist when the officers approached him, his body language a mix of exhaustion and surrender. Caleb Marlowe? Detective Lawson asked, his tone firm but not unkind. Caleb looked up, his eyes red and hollow, as though he hadn't slept in days. His gaze flickered between the detective and the officers. Yeah. What's going on? He asked, his voice hoarse. We need to talk to you about your father, Gerald, Lawson said, his eyes narrowing. We found him dead in the basement of your house. We need to understand what happened. At the mention of his father's death, Caleb's face didn't change. He didn't show any shock, any sadness, or even a hint of surprise. His expression remained blank. Gerald's dead? Caleb repeated softly as if he was still trying to process the words. Detective Lawson sat across from Caleb, his mind racing with questions. Caleb's detached demeanor was increasingly troubling. In most cases, someone who had just lost a parent would show signs of grief, confusion, or anger. But Caleb seemed almost numb, as if the murder of his father was a mere afterthought. The young man's response to the detective's questions had been sparse, but his body language told a different story. He fidgeted in his seat, his eyes darting around the room, avoiding direct eye contact. Lawson had seen this behavior before. It was often a sign of guilt or fear, but Caleb's indifference made it difficult to determine which one. Caleb, Lawson said, trying to keep his voice calm and authoritative, you're not being entirely honest with me. We found your father's body in the basement, and we know there was a struggle. There's no way you didn't hear anything, see anything, or at least know something. I need you to tell me the truth. Caleb's gaze flickered for just a moment, his eyes narrowing as if he were debating whether or not to speak. The silence stretched on, thick with tension. I don't know what happened, Caleb said finally, his voice still flat. I wasn't home. I wasn't there. Lawson pressed on. We traced your phone to a park about an hour after Gerald's death. Why didn't you come home? Why didn't you check on your father? Caleb shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his fingers tapping the table nervously. For a moment, Lawson thought he might break, but instead, Caleb simply shrugged. I didn't think he needed me. We didn't exactly have a great relationship, did we? He was always distant, too focused on his own life, his work, and his arrangements. Caleb's voice faltered slightly, as if the words had a deeper meaning, but he quickly regained his composure. His arrangements, Lawson repeated, leaning in. What exactly do you mean by that? Caleb's eyes grew dark, his expression hardening. For a moment he seemed to hesitate, as though reconsidering how much he should reveal. But after a long pause, he exhaled sharply, slumping slightly in his chair. Look, Caleb began, his voice lowering. My dad and we didn't get along. He wasn't a good father. He didn't care about me, about what I wanted, about anything. But there's something you need to understand. It wasn't just me and him. It was this whole thing, this weird relationship they had. Gerald and Eva, I mean. Lawson raised an eyebrow. You're talking about their open marriage? Caleb nodded, his eyes darkening as if the mere mention of it stirred up old, painful memories. Yeah, that. It was always there, hanging over everything. Gerald was always with other women, and Eva, well, she wasn't innocent either. She was just as caught up in it. I hated it. I hated how he treated her like a toy, how he had affairs, and she just let him. But what really killed me, what really made me angry, was how he always dismissed me. I was just this kid to him, some inconvenience in his perfect little world. The detective stayed quiet, letting Caleb speak. There was more to the story than he had originally suspected. The open marriage had clearly caused deep resentment in Caleb, and now it seemed that those feelings were tied to more than just a strained father-son relationship. Caleb was implying that there was a larger emotional and psychological conflict at play. Did you ever confront your father about it? Lawson asked, his voice even. I tried, but it was useless. He'd just laugh it off or ignore me. He didn't care. So I started pulling away. I started living my own life, doing my own thing. I didn't need his approval. But then, Caleb paused, looking down at his hands as if gathering his thoughts. Then one day I found something. What did you find? Lawson pressed, leaning forward. Caleb swallowed hard, then glanced up at the detective. I found out about one of Gerald's other women. Naomi, I think her name was. She worked for him, some younger, attractive thing who he'd been seeing behind Eva's back. I don't know exactly what happened between them, but one day I overheard them fighting in the office. Naomi was screaming at him about how she was done with being his secret, how she knew about the whole open marriage and didn't care, but she wanted more from him. And then I heard Gerald tell her he was going to end things with her. He said he had everything he needed with Eva, and that Naomi was just a phase. Caleb's voice grew bitter as he spoke. I guess he thought I didn't hear any of it, but I did. And I knew then that Gerald had no intention of stopping. He'd keep doing this until it destroyed everything. But it wasn't just about Naomi. It was about how he kept treating Eva, like she was some possession. I couldn't stand it anymore. I hated how he treated her and how he treated me. There was a heavy silence as Caleb's words sank in. The interrogation room felt smaller now, the air thick with tension. Caleb's initial defiance had slowly turned into a defensive posture. He sat across from Detective Lawson, his hands clenched tightly in his lap, his jaw rigid. The revelations from the text messages had cast a shadow over Caleb's earlier claims of innocence. Naomi, the other woman, had been a much bigger part of his life, and his father's, than anyone had initially thought. Caleb's eyes flickered nervously as Detective Lawson continued to study the evidence before him. The folder with Caleb's and Naomi's text exchanges sat between them, its weight seemingly growing heavier with every second. Caleb's mind raced, his thoughts struggling to reconcile the facts with his own version of the truth. Caleb, Lawson began, his voice even but firm, we know about your communication with Naomi. We know that you were in contact with her before your father's death. You told her quite clearly that it's time to end this. What did you mean by that? Caleb swallowed hard, his throat dry. His fingers began tapping against his leg nervously. I didn't mean anything by it, he said quickly. It's not what you think. You're telling me that ending this didn't refer to your father and Naomi? Lawson asked, raising an eyebrow. I was venting, Caleb stammered, his voice cracking. I was frustrated with how everything was turning out. I didn't mean I was going to do something. I was just angry. Lawson leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. Caleb, that's not what the texts say. You weren't just venting. You were talking about ending something specific, and that something was your father's relationship with Naomi. We've already seen that your father had no intention of ending things with her. You knew that, didn't you? Caleb shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His mouth went dry, but he said nothing. He knew the detective was right. The situation was starting to feel impossible to escape. His anger, his resentment toward Gerald, and his frustrations had clouded his judgment, and now he was in too deep to deny it. Look, Caleb finally said, his voice quieter now. I didn't kill my dad. I wasn't even home when it happened. I wasn't there. Lawson wasn't buying it. You can't keep telling me you weren't there, Caleb. We know the timeline, and we know you were at the park. But I'm not just asking about where you were. I'm asking about why you were so angry. Why you felt the need to reach out to Naomi. There's something more here, and I'm trying to get you to admit it. See, Caleb's face paled slightly, his eyes darting around the room. His fingers continued to tap on his leg, faster now, as if he were trying to escape the mounting pressure. Then with a sigh, he slumped slightly in his chair and closed his eyes. I hated him, Caleb muttered, more to himself than to Lawson. I hated the way he treated Mom, the way he treated me. He never really cared about us. It was always about his damn affairs, always about his own needs. And Eva, she wasn't any better. She let it happen. She let him destroy everything, and she just stayed. Caleb's words hung in the air, heavy with bitterness and unresolved emotions. Lawson sat back, studying the young man before him, trying to piece together the tangled mess of feelings that had led to this moment. So, Lawson said carefully, you felt betrayed, you felt abandoned, and that resentment festered until it consumed you. Caleb nodded, his eyes still closed. Yeah, I guess I just wanted it to stop. I wanted everything to go back to normal, but it was never going to be normal, not with them. Did you ever talk to Eva about how you felt? Lawson asked, his voice gentle now. Caleb shook his head. Numbers she wouldn't understand. She was too caught up in all of it. Gerald's work, his affairs. She didn't care about me either. The detective let Caleb's words sink in. There was so much emotional baggage tied up in this family, so many broken relationships and unspoken resentments. Caleb felt abandoned by both his father and stepmother, rejected by a family that had never truly been a family. But was this emotional turmoil enough to push him to murder? Lawson looked at the evidence before him. Caleb's motive, his anger, the broken family dynamics, and the text messages. There was no direct proof yet, but the circumstantial evidence was beginning to point in one direction. So, Caleb, Lawson said slowly, his eyes never leaving the young man's face. What happened that night? What exactly did you do? Caleb's head jerked up, and his eyes widened slightly as if he had just realized the gravity of the situation. He swallowed again, visibly shaken. I didn't do anything. I swear, I was at the park. I didn't hurt him. Then why didn't you come home? Lawson pressed. Why didn't you check on your father when you knew there was trouble between him and Naomi? Why not go to him, try to talk things out? I didn't think it was necessary, Caleb muttered. Detective Lawson spent the following days meticulously combing through every detail of the case. The Marlowe family's web of lies and betrayal was becoming clearer with each passing moment. He had already pieced together the relationship dynamics, the emotional turmoil, and the simmering resentment that had been bubbling beneath the surface for years. Now it was time to get the truth. The detective's mind kept returning to one thing, the will. It seemed to hold the key to unraveling the motive for Gerald Marlowe's murder. Caleb's apparent desire to inherit his father's wealth, coupled with the clause that would strip him of everything if he was convicted, painted a disturbing picture. But was Caleb truly capable of murder? Or was he just a product of a broken family, caught in a spiral of resentment and frustration. It was time to bring in Eva. Eva Marlowe had been remarkably calm since her husband's death, her demeanor almost too composed. She had been quick to cooperate with the police, offering up information about her marriage, her relationship with Gerald, and even their open arrangement. But something about her calmness bothered Lawson. People who had just lost a loved one, even in such complicated circumstances, often struggled with emotion. Eva, on the other hand, seemed eerily detached. The detective arranged for her to meet him at the police station. As she entered the interview room, Eva's presence was striking. She was a woman who seemed to carry herself with poise, but her eyes betrayed a hint of something deeper, something Lawson couldn't quite place. "Eva," Lawson began, his voice measured, "thank you for coming in today. We just have a few more questions for you. I want to go over a few things about your marriage with Gerald. You said that you and your husband had an open arrangement, correct?" Eva nodded, sitting down gracefully across from the detective. "Yes, that's right. Gerald and I were in agreement. We understood each other. It worked for us." "Tell me about that," Lawson said, leaning forward. "I'm trying to understand how this arrangement affected your family. Your relationship with Caleb, for example. How did it shape his perception of you and Gerald?" Eva took a deep breath before answering. "Gerald and we had an unconventional marriage. But Caleb, he never understood it. He didn't like the arrangement. And I get it. It wasn't easy for him to accept. But he was always so angry. He was angry at me, angry at Gerald, angry at the world." Lawson listened carefully, noting the way Eva spoke about Caleb with a certain level of detachment. Her words lacked the warmth one might expect from a mother defending her child. Instead, she sounded more resigned, almost as if she had come to terms with her son's anger long ago. "Do you think Caleb ever felt abandoned?" Lawson asked, his voice gentle but probing. "Do you think he felt like Gerald, and you prioritize your open marriage over him?" Eva's gaze hardened slightly. "Caleb always felt abandoned, but he didn't just feel that way because of our marriage. He felt neglected because he couldn't get Gerald's attention. Gerald was always so focused on his work, on his affairs, on everything else. But Caleb had his own issues too. He was always distant, always angry. He didn't want to understand, didn't want to try." Lawson leaned back, processing her words. He wasn't sure if Eva was justifying her actions or if she genuinely felt disconnected from Caleb. There was something unsettling about her cool demeanor, something that suggested she had accepted the dissolution of her family a long time ago. "Did you and Caleb ever talk about Gerald's death?" Lawson asked, trying a different approach. Eva's eyes flickered for a brief moment, but her expression remained neutral. Not really. I've been grieving in my own way, but I haven't spoken to Caleb much about it." "That's odd, don't you think?" Lawson pressed. "Your husband is dead, and yet you haven't had a single conversation with your son about it?" Eva's jaw tightened, and she looked away for a moment, her eyes focusing on something outside the room, as though she were gathering her thoughts. When she spoke again, her voice was calm but laced with something Lawson couldn't quite decipher. "Gerald's death wasn't unexpected," Eva said quietly. "We had a complicated relationship, but Caleb, he always blamed Gerald for everything. I don't know if he's capable of understanding it, but I think he's glad he's gone. Gerald's presence cast a shadow over everything. Caleb never had the chance to make peace with him." Eva's words sent a chill down Lawson's spine. He had heard the same bitter tone in Caleb's voice, but hearing it from Eva, the woman who had lived with Gerald for so many years, gave it a new context. Perhaps there was more to this than just a son's resentment. Could the family's dysfunction have reached a breaking point that no one was willing to admit? Naomi's apartment was a small, modest place in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of town. The kind of place you wouldn't expect to find someone at the center of a murder investigation. But then again, appearances often meant little when it came to the tangled lives of those involved in Gerald Marlowe's world. Detective Lawson had been waiting for this moment, waiting to hear Naomi's side of the story, to finally uncover the truth behind Gerald's murder and the role everyone in his life had played. Naomi answered the door with a mixture of surprise and wariness when Lawson introduced himself. She had been expecting the police to come eventually. How could she not? Gerald's death had been all over the news, but despite the headlines, her demeanor was calm, almost too calm, as if she had already come to terms with the chaos surrounding her. "Detective Lawson," she said, her voice steady, "I've been expecting you. You must have a lot of questions." Lawson nodded, stepping inside. Naomi motioned toward a small couch, and they both sat down, the silence stretching between them for a moment. "I'm sure you know why I'm here," Lawson began, his eyes narrowing slightly. "We need to talk about your involvement with Gerald Marlowe, and, more specifically, your relationship with his son, Caleb." Naomi's face flickered with something, perhaps guilt, perhaps recognition, but she quickly masked it, folding her hands in her lap. "What do you want to know?" "I want to know about the relationship between you, Gerald, and Caleb," Lawson said bluntly. "I want to know everything, how it started, how it ended, and whether or not Caleb had anything to do with his father's death." Naomi's eyes hardened for a brief moment, but then she sighed. "I don't think you'll understand. It was complicated." "We've heard that word a lot in this case," Lawson replied, his tone firm. "But I need the details, Naomi. I need you to be honest with me." Naomi's gaze shifted down to her hands as she hesitated, collecting her thoughts. It was clear she had been holding back, perhaps even from herself. Finally, she spoke. "Gerald and I were close," she began, her voice quieter now, tinged with something Lawson couldn't quite place. "Too close, I suppose. When I met him, he was charismatic, powerful, everything I wanted at the time. But he was married, and I knew it. I didn't mind. I had my own things going on. We had an arrangement, a mutual understanding. Gerald was always honest about his marriage, and I thought I could handle it." Lawson watched her closely, noting the subtle way she emphasized honest, as though that word was supposed to absolve her of any guilt. He wasn't sure if she believed that, or if she was trying to convince herself. "But it wasn't just about him and me," Naomi continued, her voice gaining some steadiness. "It was about his son. Caleb always knew about me. He didn't like me. He hated me, really. He thought I was ruining his family. But the truth is, Gerald never really paid attention to Caleb. He was too busy with me, too focused on his affairs. Caleb was always second in his eyes, always second to whatever Gerald wanted." "So, what did you think about Caleb?" Lawson asked. "Was he just a victim in all of this? Or did he play a part?" Naomi paused again, her lips pursing as though considering how much to reveal. She looked up, meeting Lawson's gaze for the first time since the conversation began. "Caleb was angry," she said slowly, her voice almost regretful. "I know that. But what people don't understand is that he had a lot of anger toward his father. And a lot of it wasn't about me. It was about Gerald's neglect. He thought his father didn't care about him. He was right to some extent. Gerald was too wrapped up in his own world, in his own needs." "And did Caleb ever express that anger to you directly?" Lawson pressed. Naomi hesitated, her gaze turning away as she searched for the right words. "Yes, sometimes. He would talk about how his father never listened to him, how Gerald's marriage to Eva was just a cover for everything. He was bitter about the whole situation. But I never thought he would take it that far." Lawson studied her, his mind racing as pieces started to fall into place. Naomi was beginning to paint a picture of a young man crushed under the weight of neglect and resentment. But there was something more lurking beneath the surface. Naomi knew something that had to do with Caleb's involvement in his father's death. "Naomi," Lawson said, his voice now steady and commanding, "I need to ask you about the night Gerald died. Where were you?" Her eyes widened slightly, but she quickly regained her composure. "I was home, alone. I had been out earlier, but I came back to my place around midnight." "Did you speak to Gerald that night?" Lawson asked, leaning forward. "Were you in contact with him?" Naomi shook her head slowly. "No, I didn't speak to him that night.